Have you ever wondered, like, how much power just a handful of people could have over a huge idea, like climate change?
Hmm.
We're really diving deep today into a book that makes that exact argument that a small group can have that much power. It's called The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science.
Okay.
And just to be clear, we're not here to say who's right or wrong. We just want to unpack the arguments, see how this stuff works, how information gets shaped and presented, even in science.
Absolutely, yeah. It's
Yeah.
important to look at everything, try to put the pieces together.
Exactly. So the book starts with this idea of a palace guard,
Hmm.
basically a group of scientists kind of protecting a very particular narrative about climate change. What do you make of that?
Well, you got to think. Controlling information. That's
Yeah.
powerful, no matter what the topic is. Whoever shapes the story, well, they often shape what everyone believes.
Right.
And in science, a lot of that shaping happens through what gets published, how the media covers it, even things like Wikipedia, surprisingly.
Because that's where we all go for information these days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book claims this palace guard. That's what they use. They use these channels to steer the whole climate change conversation.
Mm.
They specifically point to this blog, Real Climate, as an example.
Okay, yeah, I think I've seen that. It's written by climate scientists, right?
Yeah, and that's part of their whole thing. They present themselves as working climate scientists.
Mm-hmm.
Instantly more credible, right?
Mhm.
Potentially, at least. Maybe more than other voices in the debate.
So it's almost like it's not just about the data itself. It's about who's presenting it and how they're doing it.
Exactly. And the book, it gets even more pointed. It claims that this group, they even went so far as to influence entries on Wikipedia,
Ooh.
which, let's face it, it's a lot of people's first stop for research.
It's true. Yeah.
And one person they single out is William Connolly.
Okay, what did Connolly do?
So he was really, really heavily involved in editing Wikipedia articles on, you guessed it, climate change. So now imagine just for a second, if that information is, well, skewed, or even just incomplete. Think about the effect. People researching the topic could come away with a totally biased understanding, you see.
It is kind of unsettling when you think about it like that. We really do rely on those sources to be accurate.
Right. That's exactly why this Talus Guard idea, this control over information, it's such a big deal. It makes you question who's actually shaping the story we hear about climate change and what their agenda really is.
It's funny, when we talk about this whole controlling information thing, one image that always pops into my head, it's that hockey stick graph.
Yeah.
It's everywhere when you talk about climate change. But this book, they claim there is some shady stuff going on behind the scenes with that graph.
Right. It's become almost like a symbol, hasn't it? Really central to this whole climate change debate.
For sure.
It's that image,
Yeah.
flat temperatures for ages, then boom, up it goes, just like the blade of a hockey stick.
Yeah.
And the timing, not a coincidence,
Yeah.
right, lines up perfectly with industrialization taking off.
The implication being humans are the cause, that sudden warming.
Exactly. And it's a powerful visual. The book argues that power, that's exactly why it got pushed so hard, spread so widely, even influenced policy decisions.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. To make it that powerful, to make that impact, the book says dissenting voices, other viewpoints, they were silenced, pushed aside.
Really? How so?
Through peer review, primarily. Or rather, through manipulating it.
Peer review, you mean like when other scientists, they check the research before it gets published?
Exactly. A quality control, you could say, ideally.
Right.
But the book, it suggests that process was, let's just say, influenced to favor any studies that backed up that hockey stick narrative. They even have excerpts from emails, scientists, and they seem to be discussing ways to make sure dissenting papers, ones that disagree, don't see the light of day, don't get published in those big journals.
Wow. Isn't that like academic sabotage or something?
It's a serious accusation, no doubt.
Is that what happened with that editor, James Sayers, at Geophysical Research Letters? I think the book mentioned him.
Yeah, the book uses Sayers as an example. An editor allegedly removed from his position after he published research that happened to challenge that hockey stick graph. Now, whether that's the real reason he was removed, that's up for debate.
Right.
But it does highlight the book's point about suppressing voices that don't agree with the main narrative.
It makes you wonder if there was that much pressure to, go along with a certain viewpoint. Did we really get the full story? Scientifically speaking, I mean.
It's the big question, isn't it? The book's argument is that pressure, that alleged suppression of dissent, it created this killing effect, made other scientists hesitant to speak up, even if they had doubts about the data, the methods, anything.
So even if the science behind the hockey stick, let's say it was solid, all this control over information, it still might have prevented a more, I don't know, a more honest discussion.
Exactly. And that leads us to another point the book brings up, the uncertainties that are just inherent in trying to figure out past temperatures.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They argue that the data, while valuable, it's not perfect, it has limitations,
Mhm.
makes it really hard to be definitive about long-term climate trends. Even the IPCC acknowledges that, by the way.
Which they would have to, right? I mean, we didn't exactly have weather stations thousands of years ago, so how do we know what the temperature even was back then?
Right. There are ways, different methods, but they all have their limitations. Like tree rings, for example.
Oh, yeah.
They can give us clues about past climate conditions, sure, but a perfect record of temperature, not really. The width of a tree ring,
Mm.
that can be affected by how much rain there was, how much sunlight, all sorts of things, not just temperature.
So we're kind of piecing together the past climate from these little clues, but there's always that margin of error.
Exactly.
Right.
And that uncertainty, it's even more important when you start talking about climate models, which are basically super complex simulations of the Earth's climate system.
Right, and those are used to make predictions about future climate change, right? Which, speaking of predictions, this book is pretty skeptical of those too. One of their claims is that every single climate prediction the IPCC has made has been wrong.
Well, it's not quite that simple. The book's argument is that while climate models are useful, they're based on our current understanding of a ridiculously complex system. And that complexity, it means there are always going to be uncertainties in the projections.
So it's not that climate models are always wrong, but that we should look at them with a critical eye, understand their limits.
Exactly. The book suggests that by not being upfront about those uncertainties, it creates this sense of false certainty, which then can influence policy decisions, public opinion, all of it.
Right, right. So we've talked about how hard it is to figure out past temperatures and how complex these climate models are, but what about the evidence for humans causing climate change? The book seems to be saying it's not as clear-cut as we're often led to believe. It's like we're drowning in uncertainty here. If the past temperature data is shaky and climate models are so complex, I mean, what does that even mean for this idea that humans are causing climate change?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The book's point seems to be that this focus on human activity, like we're the only cause, it might be overshadowing other stuff. Like
Yeah.
they suggest that natural climate variability, which has always existed, right?
Right.
That might be way more important than current models acknowledge.
So, not that humans have zero impact, but it's more nuanced than just humans are doing it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
The book really hammers home this need for like a more balanced view, one that factors in human influence, sure, but also these natural climate cycles that have always been happening.
Okay, yeah.
And they argue that by doing that, by acknowledging how complex this climate system really is and how little we actually know,
Mm.
that's how we'll make better decisions about dealing with it.
That makes sense, right? If you're only looking at one piece of it, you miss the whole picture.
Totally.
It sounds like the book is really pushing for more open-mindedness in climate science, like
Yeah.
allowing for different viewpoints, different ways of interpreting the data.
You got it. It's about creating that kind of scientific culture,
Right.
one where critical thinking is encouraged,
Mm.
where it's okay to be skeptical, to have real debates,
Mhm.
even, or maybe especially, on something as big as climate change. That's how science moves forward,
Mm.
by questioning things.
This has been eye-opening, to say the least. Really makes you realize that even in science, it's not always so clear-cut. There's a lot of gray area, a lot of unknowns, and a lot of room for different perspectives.
Couldn't agree more. And that's why it's so important for all of us, not just the scientists, to really be informed, to think critically about the information we're getting. Look at where it's coming from, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Exactly. So, to our listeners out there, next time you see some big headline about climate change, remember what we talked about today. Don't take it at face value. Look deeper. Who's saying it? Why are they saying it? And if something doesn't seem quite right, dig a little deeper.
That's right.
Understanding climate change, it's a journey, not a sprint. And like any good journey, you got to be prepared, you got to be curious, you got to ask questions, and you got to be open to new information.